So you might be selling something that the organization may have just invested last year in buying from somebody else. So there's no point wasting your time trying to, knock the door and spend all that effort. We don't want to be looking at technologies that are not going to last long, or companies might go bust. Even if you've done all the groundwork, even if you've done the POCs, if you've proven your product, they might still do a three-party RFP. The number one cause of strikes, I would say, or heartache in big enterprises is cybersecurity. You don't want to be the reason for that, your product or your service. As we know from October, November 22, AI has just exploded on the scene. And most organizations are kind of trying to figure it out.
What's the best way to get a CIO's attention?
Sometimes I get messages which addresses me as somebody else because it was cut and pasted from some, 20 different messages. Please don't do that.
How does one get a CIO excited about becoming potentially an advisor? And
some companies are very clear that they don't want their C-suite to be sitting on some boards.
Hi, Sandeep. I'm so excited to have you on this episode of the Svagat show.
Hey, thank you, Rishabh. Really excited to be here and looking forward to the discussion. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Sandeep has been the CIO of some pretty large companies, managed incredibly massive budgets, been an innovative thought leader. Till most recently, Sandeep was the CIO of GXO Logistics, which is a multi-billion-dollar logistics conglomerate. Before that, he spent many years at organizations like FootLocker, Johnson & Johnson. There's tens and thousands of startups that try selling into the enterprise every year. What does it mean, selling into the enterprise? And how is that different from SMBs or even mid-market?
First of all, thank you again, Rishabh, for having me. You're very nicely elaborated my background with very large corporations. Johnson & Johnson, huge, big, at the time when I was there, $80 billion company. Use large spends in IT. FootLocker, which is again a very fast-moving consumer product, retail, omnichannel retail, e-commerce, as well as stores. And then GXO Logistics and XPO, which are supply chain companies, which are kind of the glue that drive business. So with all that experience, there's a pretty good perspective here on what it means to sell, right? You already alluded to size of the corporations, right? So whether it's an SMB, whether it's a mid-cap, large-cap size of company. The size of a company has a big factor to play in how you approach, especially startups approach. Because the bigger the size, the more the complexity, more the stakeholders, more the spread of the organization. You need to be more thoughtful about whom you are reaching out to. People always think that CIO is the important stakeholder in tech selling, especially P2P. But that may not be often the case. There are many, many stakeholders in the company which will not be relating to the IT. They're practitioners. They are functional leaders and or users of capabilities, and they might have a big role to play. So again, it's kind of a broad answer, but we can dig into the specifics of that. Size definitely is a criteria. The type of business, the nature of the industry is definitely a criteria. The spread of the organization, the geo spread of the organization is definitely a criteria. And all these things, need to fit into the GTM strategy of the startup.
Yeah, absolutely. And so say you've got a startup and they've got a really innovative product which is relevant for the IT org. How do they sort of navigate the enterprise? Like let's just sort of start from there, right?
You need to be extremely clear about what are you trying to sell. What is the value proposition? What's the ROI? Is it revenue gain? Is it productivity gain? Is it cost saving? Is it some absolutely amazing new capability that the customer may not be even aware of, that is game-changing for whatever their business is? And generally, founders have a good idea of what that is. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in the selling game. But just making sure that not just founders, people who are helping the founders to go to market, understand that value proposition. Second thing then is you really have to analyze every organization separately. Who's your potential customer? Whose problem are you solving? Who has the pain that needs to be solved? Is it a functional leader? It's a user down the line, mid-management? Is it a developer even? So depending on that, you decide where your first immediate strategies. Are you approaching the CIO? Are you approaching somebody in the CIO organization, the chief data officer? Are you approaching a CFO even? Your pitch might be playing towards immediate gains in cost savings or in working capital gains. The second thing I would say is understand your buying stakeholders? Who are the decision makers? The decision makers may not necessarily have the control to the purse strings. Somebody else may have the pen, but they may not have the power to influence writing a check or making a decision. So you have that map around what problem are you solving, first of all. Second, who has the pain and who has the need. Third is, are they the decision maker? Typically, the money trail or whoever's signing the financials, they will have some sort of influence. And you draw your influencer map and you go from there. Life cycle of an organization also plays an important role. You should also probably spend some time looking at if you're selling a product or a service that has competition and you're not sort of, that new in the market, but you might have something else. You also want to know who else is already engaged in the organization and at what stage are they engaged, right? So you might be selling something or bringing a service that the organization may have just invested last year in buying from somebody else. So there's no point wasting your time trying to, knock the door and spend all that effort. Industry plays a role as well. In a certain industry, highly regulated industries have very long sales cycles. They will go through a lot of due diligence before deciding and investing money into somebody who's new or some company that's new. That plays a role as well. And obviously, you need to have a little good understanding of the tech agenda of the company. Are they a mature organization? Are they going through some transformation exercises on their side where the propensity might be higher, listening to new things, right? And that plays a role as well. So, I mean, these are some of the key factors. I think I'd start with that exercise first, bring the company in the crosshairs, do this analysis, and then decide your strategy.
One of the things that ends up happening with startups is that they are often in the early stages of their journey, they might not have a fully featured product, right? So like if you compare it to the market incumbent, let's look at companies like Microsoft, Oracle, the usual suspects, right? IBM. Normally what ends up happening is when they look at an enterprise, there might be something like an RFP, which might have like this entire list of like whatever, right? Like 50, 60 different features and the capabilities that people are looking for. At that point, how should startups think about their offering? Because often what ends up happening with enterprises is also that they'll ask for certain things and the startups have to also keep in mind their entire roadmap and just sort of prioritizing as an org themselves. Any thoughts on that or what you've seen companies do?
Many times, many of the startup founders, obviously, they're working on a concept of an MVP, right? And I sometimes say the MVP needs to be looked at a bit differently. People call MVP as minimum viable product, right? But I would say P should be looked at, especially by founders, as a minimum valuable product. And I go back to the value again. So, and that's where the pull comes and you're absolutely right, because the timing of the need that is latent, as in the customer may not know they have a need, and a need that probably is not even identified because you're trying to sell something so innovative that the customer doesn't know there is a value in that. So you need to really figure out, I mean, I keep using the word value, but really I mean it because, people on the other side, everybody has a shortage of time. You got to get that value from very, very quickly and very fast and very clear. Even though your product is, say, of the 10 features that you think are absolutely essential in your product to be able to be a worthy competitor or a worthy entrant into this company, and you only have 3 now, even those 3, the value should be very evident before you talk. Otherwise, I wouldn't waste my time and the customer's time, right? And generally, people will listen. If the value is very clear, they will listen. They will wait if they see, and it's a trust that the people see, a trust that they put in what they see and when they meet people on how you believe in your roadmap, how you believe in that value, and the value fit is very evident and clear. So I would say that should be a singular focus, right? Even though you're not there yet, first of all, think about the timing. Don't go too early because, go at the right time where the apparent value of what you've done is meaningful, and you start from there.
Yeah. Um, when you've been, CIOs at different organizations, did you end up working with a lot of startups as
Let's take the last 10 years, right? The beginning of those 10 years was I was finishing at J&J, and I was responsible for digital e-commerce type technologies, mobile app technologies. Then I went to FootLocker, which is omni-channel, sort of between the 2014 to 17 period, and then GXO and XPO. But all of these companies, remember, and most other companies as well, we are in a time in the last decade and going forward for the next decade, we are in disruptive times. We are in disruptive times due to various things, not just technology bringing in the disruption, but also various things, consumer behaviors, macro changes that are happening in the world. Those are bringing in disruptions. And many large enterprises are thinking about it all the time. about these disruptions and how they can keep their business ahead of the game, right? And that's a good thing for startups because, if you are building a product or a service that is really solving a problem that, the disruption brings in, you will get a ear. People will hear you, right? So to answer your question, I've seen in the last 10 years, a gradual increase in my career of listening to startups. I'd say probably 20 years ago, there would be more barriers to entry. 15 years ago, less so. 10 years ago, even less. And now, I mean, organizations have specialized cells or functions that look at just startups and evaluate startups. If they don't do it internally, they'll find a third party that does it for them, right? For example, one of my employer had a inbuilt inherent internal function, which they call it the incubator, where startups can come and pitch. In GXO, for example, I kicked off an external party that helps scan the horizon for early stage startups and mid stage startups, and then filter them out and bring the right ones that solve a problem. So various organizations adopt various techniques to evaluate startups. I would say the profile of CIOs and CTOs that's happening now is very different from CIOs of 2 decades ago or even a decade and a half ago. The CIOs of now, they are tech leaders in their own right. They're entrepreneurs within the company. When I certainly look at myself, I feel like that, as opposed to in the past where CIOs and CTOs were had a somewhat operational type role, keep the IT running, bring down the cost, do some innovation, help process improvement. That's great. But these days, CIOs and CTOs are part of the decision-making cycle. They have a seat at the table in their management. Certainly, I had, and that means a lot because then you're bringing in ideas. You're bringing in amazing things that are happening that help you tackle and address the disruption. So I think that's a good thing for startups, and they should understand the DNA and the dynamic of each organization.
Any advice to startup founders on how they can cut down on the sales cycle, given that you have insider's knowledge on how these processes work?
Right. You know what? I mean, I'm kind of touching on a small point, which probably you would have kept for the end, because I've been in this corporate IT, CIO tech jobs for decades now. And people who know me probably know that I'm switching sides and getting to the other side of the desk. But we'll come to that later. The reason I made that point is I'm thinking very deeply about this aspect. I'm thinking of people who are coming and selling to me from startups and how I was thinking and what are the pitfalls and the pluses and the minuses and how do you tackle those. And I'm kind of boiling it down, that strategy into sort of 4 areas. Okay, one is know your ideal customer inside out. Who's your ideal customer for your product and service? You need to know that. Be super clear about that. You have limited resource. You want to get the biggest bang for the buck. But how do you get down to a strategy that delivers that? So first, know your ideal customer. Be clear to yourself. Second is be clear to yourself what value you're delivering. Again, I sound like a broken record, but let's do it. And then start segmenting your customers, right? By industry, by use cases, by stakeholders within the prospect customers, and so on and so forth. What life cycle they are in their journey of being able to use your product, right? And lastly, there are some super frameworks, man. There's Medic, and now I think there's evolution of that called Metric as well. And it talks about metrics, qualifying the potential gain. It talks about the economic buyer who's signing the check. We talked about, right? The decision process. We talked about the D. It talks about decision criteria, the second D. Identifying the pain of the customer. And then finally, who's your champion? Who's going to stand by your side? You need a champion, right? So use frameworks like that because that will help you segment. That will help you bring down your long list of wherever you're going to point the crosshairs to a very short list and a very specific list where your chances of success are increased. And that's your GTM strategy.
One of the things that you mentioned in point 2 was just figure out where the company is in their life cycle for them to be able to use your product. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. I think a life cycle has 2 or 3 dimensions, right? One is a life cycle of the organization itself. Is it a heritage organization that's been in the business for hundreds of years, century, decade, whatever, or it's a new company, right? Companies can happen due to certainly one of them, my employers happened because they divested and carved out of a bigger organization. So that life cycle has a role to play, right? Because when companies are new, there's certain different types of decision-making processes as well as technology products that they'll be looking. Secondly, a life cycle dimension also means whether there's any massive transformation activity happening at the customer, right? Because that's part of the life cycle as well. Companies organize and undertake purposeful very clear transformation strategies. They might even have chief transformation officers, and their job is nothing but to look at how can the organization change its legacy or historic ways of working, processes, technology, all of that, to modernize, to bring them what is relevant, what brings value for them. Understand that part of the life cycle. Third part of the life cycle, I would say, is absolutely knowing about, is the company going for example, it's a private company going for an IPO. Maybe it's a large corporation that is going for divestiture, the other side of the coin. The company is not newly formed, but it's a large company, but might want to divest and create a company. All these things have different area, elements to play in your strategy. So I would say life cycle dimension is that essentially, the age, history of the company, that has definitely a big dimension. Second is, are they undergoing any transformation, purpose-driven transformation? That opens up opportunities, right? Third is, are there any big life cycle events planned in the company? Acquisitions, divestitures, carve-outs, IPOs, whatever that is. That will bring in opportunities, right? And that's the life cycle dimension.
Let's move a little bit towards pricing. So, a lot of startups typically, there's two kinds that I've seen. There's one that sort of start from a more PLG, SMB approach, and then they sort of work their way towards the mid-market and then the enterprise. This is sort of the classic crossing the chasm strategy of go-to-market, right? Then there's also companies that directly try to move and co-create solutions with the enterprise from day one. In the first case, typically for ease of use, companies tend to have more of a, more simple pricing structure, and they just come in and sort of working with their clients. But wanted to understand, as startups approach large companies, how should they think about pricing? What's the right way for a startup? Because I'm sure you get pitched pricing models day in, day out from different companies.
Sure, yeah. And I see pricing is a lever. It's a very important strategic lever for any startup. It can be a make or break lever, clearly. It might have the best product, but if you're kind of not getting the plot on how you go to market with your pricing, with your commercial, that can either propel you or hinder your progress. But it has to be simple to understand, because if I look at it from a startup's perspective, there are various layers to the pricing. It's what the cost of building the product, you've obviously got to recover. But remember, customers have lots of tools on their end as well for pricing evaluation. There are many organizations will bring in specialist vendors to help them negotiate pricing and contracts and deals. Obviously, that happens for more mature, large contracts with the likes of Microsoft or IBM and these companies. Especially for startups, I would say, first of all, spend some time looking at your own life cycle, where you are, how many customers you have in the bag, and then deciding the pricing, which can be progressive. I think you touched on the point that when you're new, when you want that first 10 customers, you might have to invest, and you might have to give your product free and charge for just the service. Probably, yeah, or co-create, as you mentioned, right? Where the value is not there. Probably for the next 10 customers, that's where you start building some sort of EBITDA target. So my first guidance there is keep the pricing simple to understand. Even though it might be complex in the background on your side, you got to pay the cloud providers, is pricing based on consumption, blah, 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 all that is fine. Make it simple to understand. And sometimes customers appreciate consumption-based pricing because, in today's day and age, when lots of cloud provider pricing and a lot of technologies are on the cloud, the biggest challenge many of the CIOs face these days is not having an upfront handle on what their costs are going to be. Because every organization works on a planned budget, and then you stick to that budget. And if there's anything that brings in uncertainty or element of risk in your budget, that becomes a challenging situation. So I think create a product that has some degree of assurance that the pricing is not going to have hidden costs, is not going to have, even if it's a consumption-based pricing, the consumption itself is very well predicted as to how it will be and based on whatever you're selling. But the simplicity, predictability, I would start with that. That's the first layer. Second is obviously it's got to be competitive. So understand whom you're playing against, right? Your strategy in the early stage might be different in pricing as opposed to when your product is well established and gaining the traction and in the market, right? So many times customers would like to know what sort of price increases would you be looking at if they go for long-term contracts? Is there any inflation-based increases that you'll be seeking? They would want to know upfront. So take that into account as well. And obviously, we're all in the business for making money. Sometimes being transparent about how much margin you're making helps. Now, that's a double-edged sword because it might either make your customer feel that you're being very honest, transparent, and you earn a fair share of profit, or they might say, wow, we're making so much profit. Why? At our cost. So got to be careful with that particular aspect. And lastly, I would say, pricing, you need to, as a strategy, not look at the pricing now, but look at the pricing in context of what you're planning for the next 5 years. I wouldn't say as far as your exit or, those terminologies on, because pricing is ultimately driving revenue. Revenue is ultimately driving your multiples if you're in a B2B SaaS business. So not about pricing now or this year or next year. Think a bit long term, where you're heading, what type of customers. Hopefully that gives you some pointers on, but as a CIO, I'll just turn that around a little bit. I will definitely be looking for pricing that's simple to understand, predictable, at least in my budget cycle or even beyond. Third is competitive, that if you have a competition, it's not X, or I might give more money, but the value, again, goes back to the value proposition. If there is a value that is bigger and better and, more evident than whoever your next competitor is, of course, I'll pay more. So the value linked to the pricing. And then the last thing I would say is, in terms of how that pricing would play out if I were to be, but most CTOs, CIOs would look for long-term partners. I'm not looking at your product just in the short term to use it and for the year or next 6 months or 2 months. I'm looking for partnerships. So what do I get for that long-term partnership? Hence, long-term thinking helps.
And so on that, as I speak to a lot of founders, this is something that I notice in a lot of companies that have been started by engineers, because early on in the journey, they might not have a VP of sales. And so typically when, say, you have two engineers that have started the company, one of them is probably donning the hat of a CEO. They're used to simple pricing as they see on SaaS products, right? X dollars per user per month, or some hours of compute with their margin on top, or things like that. They don't realize what are the things that they can and cannot charge. So, for example, things like implementation fees or things like training costs. Like there are budgets established in the enterprise where you are probably expecting. So where I'm coming from is, like sometimes you can end up seeing a pricing which might make you think like, hey, how will these guys ever make money? Because as a CIO, you're also sort of balancing a sword where you want the best deal for your employer, but at the same time, you don't want to be squeezing the startup out so much that they don't exist next year, right?
Super point. See, as an enterprise buyer decision maker, I made a statement about being long term. We're playing for the long term. We don't want to be looking at technologies that are not going to last long, or that are, companies might go bust. That's a very important factor in choosing a startup, right? We want technologies that are fantastic, but also that are going to stay with us for a long period of time. So there is a vested interest in making you successful and making you profitable. You have to earn a fair profit to make your company successful. You mentioned the professional services, the cost of implementation. It's very important in big enterprises, because you should probably spend some time thinking, here's my product pricing, whatever license fees or consumption-based pricing and this and that. But to make the product prove that, give its value, I will need some time from people and effort, and from not just my people, the customers' people as well. And there's a price attached to that. There's a cost attached to that. Need to take that into account. Professional services, whatever that is, but also being clear about it. I've seen many times startups and SaaS products especially saying contact us for more details, right? And that's great. But if you want to get the pull, give a little indication of what that could be, at least a range, a spectrum, size, scale, something like that. One other point I think I missed earlier was I talked about budgets and predictability and planning. But remember, budgets, it can be expense budget, or OPEX budget, or it can be a capital investment, which can be depreciated in the P&L and books, right? Depending on your product, whether it's capitalized or whether it's an ongoing expense, as a factor in the decision making as well, right? And your pricing, obviously, and of course, these things follow gap guidelines and capitalization rules of different countries. So be a little aware of that. Take that thinking into account when you decide your pricing. There are certain elements of your pricing that perhaps can't be capitalized because they are ongoing costs. You need to pay them, and they are kind of an expense. But there might be a certain element of sort of building, implementing, creating an asset that can be capitalized. And the capitalization helps because that, that gets appreciated, and that is treated differently in companies' books, right? So be aware of that aspect as well. So
Can you give an example of something that could be capitalized that you've seen?
So, you build it, say you have a technology that you're selling, and now that technology can be hosted within the customer's ecosystem on their infrastructure. And I'm not even talking about cloud or whatever else, in their infrastructure. And again, please don't quote me on this, because you need to be looking at every case very specifically from a accountants and the CFO point of view of what can and cannot be capitalized. But there are strict rules around if you're building an asset. Assets are always pieces of capital investment that have longevity, that get depreciated over time, as opposed to a service that you're using ongoing and you're paying and you're expensing it. You're paying for a service which cannot be capitalized. And these are treated very differently in the books. So if your product is something that a customer specific has a strong IP or an asset value for the customer, it will depreciate over time, then it's a capital expense or it's a capital. And if it is not, if it is a use-based service, if it's a cloud-based, most cloud-based things these days can't be capitalized. They become part of the OpEx. So those need to take into account because that might impact your selling process, that might impact your pricing even, right? So you need to take that.
Got it. Got it. And so on the point of pricing, how does price discovery work in the organizations that you worked at?
I think for me, I'll speak from my experience. I mean, the organization worked a fairly large company, so there are structured processes and there are dedicated functions and individuals that are responsible for contract negotiations, for price discovery, for evaluation, criteria. There are 3 or 4 things I think that you need to be aware of. One is you might have the stakeholders who are responsible for the decision making, like we talked earlier, who feel the pain, who have the need, whose problems you're solving. There might be champions and there might be people who have the purse strings. But then there are people who are looking at evaluation purely commercially, purely as a vendor management process. So these might be people in procurement. These might be people in, say, vendor management function of the tech department. You need to be identifying who those are and what that process is. Because again, it's very different for different companies. Companies I work for have had very structured vendor management functions. In many cases, the vendor management function was part of my team to decide. And these functions have multiple roles to do. One is clearly they run the processes, the RFP process or a contract negotiation process or building an SOW and what have you. So they become the custodians for this process. Number 2, they are the ones who will negotiate the pricing, and they might use certain tools for that. They might go to third parties who might be deal brokers, right, to help them benchmark. They'll use third party tools to be benchmarking your capabilities and your pricing and offering against similar organizations and your competitors and compare and contrast. They might also use some sort of a very structured process. Even if you have done all the groundwork, even if you've done the POCs, if you've proven your product, they might still do a 3-party RFP. So again, it's different dynamics. So identify who those individuals are, those functions. Sometimes what happens is the larger the company, sometimes these processes can be a bit, I guess, clunky or a bit time consuming. So you need to factor that into your sales process and sales cycle as well. I've seen situations where, your product is proven, it is tested, it's got a good spark, but it will still take time to get over the line and get that purchase order signed because it's just the process is long. The various parties. So be aware of what that is. That part tends to be a little bit neglected sometimes, especially, organizations, as you say, young engineers, they may not be fully aware of these processes or that these things exist in big companies, right?
Any feedback on how to make POCs successful?
Oh, wow. My favorite word, value, right? Be very clear at the beginning of the POC, what will constitute success? What does success look like? What is the criteria for evaluating success? What is the criteria for evaluating success? What's the metrics? It has to be measurable, right? It has to be measurable. So you need to write down, here are the criteria that will evaluate the POC on. Against each criteria, here's the metrics that constitute success, whatever that threshold might be. Make it data-driven, make it measurable, and then write it down. Get that alignment and agreement up front with whoever is evaluating the POC, saying that, are we aligned that this is how we constitute and look at success for this POC? And once both parties are on the same page in terms of the criteria for measurement, metrics for success, then you go for it. And I think one important aspect of POCs is timing as well. A POC is only good if it is done on time. A POC that might end up in good results, but it takes a long time, and the timing threshold is not managed. That can be a metric and criteria as well.
Yeah. One of the challenges that happens with POCs is even before you can get started, if you've not sold or not had too much time or experience selling into the enterprise, you sort of get hit by this thing called InfoSec, and you realize that you're spending all your time just doing things which don't even have anything to do with your product anymore, right? Like there are all these checklists and you're moving from one department to another. The security posture that's required to sell into some of these large companies. There's so many compliance requirements and guidelines and things like that. Can you speak about that aspect?
You may think that this has nothing to do with your product, but it has everything to do with your product, especially if you're building a product for the enterprise. The number one cause of strife, I would say, or heartache, using a colloquial word in big enterprises, is cybersecurity, is information security, right? Organizations tend to lose a lot if they are risked and if they're breached, and if you don't want to be the reason for that breach. It can't be something for last minute thinking or post POC thinking. You got to bring that up front. Okay, number one. And I think this is a really cool point you're making, because most organizations are going very structured about this. And remember, internally within organizations, there is a tension playing as well. People who are responsible for the cybersecurity and InfoSec, they want to be helping the company to stay secure. But sometimes internally in organization, they're also seen as the police, the bad guys, who are creating hurdles. I think that's changing now. Depending on how the InfoSec function is structured in the company, sometimes its function may not be sitting under the CIO or CTO. It might be a third function sitting under somewhere else to have no conflict of interest, and that's okay. But you need to be thinking about those aspects upfront in your negotiation, in your planning, in your even go-to-market, and embedding those discussions at the right time. Even if the customer thing may seem a little bit relaxed about it, but please highlight that, do you have any requirements around InfoSec? How can we make sure they are taken care of? And that will, in fact, raise your value much more if you're proactively bringing up these subjects, InfoSec related subjects. So my suggestion there is be very proactive. Do seriously take into account all the needs around InfoSec and cybersecurity, and be very clear about the frameworks, right? I mean, then there's a strong NIST framework, NIST framework that most companies use as a standard cybersecurity benchmarking framework. Or there could be other compliance rules, SOX rules, certainly compliance rules around regulatory processes if you're in the pharma industry or in the oil and gas industry, and there are various other regulators that need to come and play. There are a lot of new rules coming around, environment friendliness or environmental impact. Europe has laws around that about how companies destruct their unused product. That's slightly off the topic right now, but it might have an impact with what you're doing and building. So be aware of the regulatory aspects as well. And if you bring these topics, which might not seem central to your offering, but have very much influence on how the decisions happen, be very proactive. And I think that will definitely show a much different class of organization that you want to become.
And this also sort of ties back into when I was asking you earlier around how can you just shorten the sales cycle, right?
I completely agree, because you're doing this in a planned, proactive manner as opposed to an afterthought, right?
Yeah. Like just over the years, if you look at the budget that you've been allocating to vendors which are established versus either startups or companies which are sort of rising stars a couple of years in, have you seen that sort of split increase over the last decade or so?
Yes, it has. I think what has happened, the short answer is yes, and probably the longer answer is, organizations are becoming much more structured in that planning. At the beginning of this meeting, we talked about organizations having specific functions that could be helping incubate ideas, or third parties externally that might be helping to bring ideas. And what's becoming more of a norm than exception is companies allocating a pot of budget, maybe a small pot, but it's still a pot, to these kind of activities, right? Sometimes they may not just allocate a pot, but they might have, because every pot essentially and a pot of budget has an owner. And more and more often what happens is these ownership is transitioning towards people who have responsibility for innovation or transformation. And that's definitely happening. And especially now it's happening more, because as we know from October, November 22, this whole thing called Gen AI has just exploded on the scene. And most organizations are kind of trying to figure it out, trying to build POCs.
So I'm so glad that you brought up the Gen AI part. Companies are in this transitionary phase where they are sort of reevaluating their software budgets, because every company that I speak to, every VC who's evaluating these startups wants to know that, are these budgets that all these Gen AI companies are getting, are they the one-time innovation budget, or are they part of like a line item? And in 9 out of 10 cases, it tends to be like this innovation budget because I feel like maybe organizations are also trying to grapple with their entire cost base, right? It's sort of being reevaluated. And now when you put that in the context of the news that Klarna a little while back announced that they're getting rid of Workday and Salesforce and trying to build in-house, it feels like a lot of rules are being rewritten.
See, we are in a state of flux as far as I'm specifically talking about Gen AI. Listen, AI is not new. AI has been on the scene for long. But I think people are even looking at AI, machine learning, which are technologies that have been here for a decade or longer, through a different lens now of what opportunities Gen AI brings, especially large language models, small language models, multimodal models, all of these new things that are coming up. We are in a state of flux. And why I say that is while there are certain very basic use cases around search, around, entity extraction, around looking through unstructured data and things like that, those are becoming more ticed. We're still not there yet. In more hard hitting, more enterprise class use of Gen AI. It's happening. There are many, many applications that have been operationalized even for Gen AI. So what's going to happen? And this is again, I don't have a crystal ball, but this is my kind of logical thinking, I guess, is over a period of time in the coming, say, 18, 24 months, we are going to go through a normalization process, an equilibrium, and will be, I think, more and more certainly vendors and technologies in the Gen AI space that will focus on enterprise. Again, without naming names, I know at least three vendors who are looking at the enterprise space in Gen AI who are absolutely putting all the energy behind it. And these are core vendors who build models, right, who are marketing models. And then there is the second tier vendors who are using the models to build capabilities around that for the enterprise space. Even large companies like Oracle is doing that now. We'll go through that period of normalization, maturization, whatever the right word is. Probably it's the wrong word, but you know what I mean. And as that happens, there will be more structure in the process of how companies adopt. Most organizations I know, certainly most progressive organizations I know, have some or the other initiatives going on. Certainly in the last organization I personally set up a small group, a very small group, albeit, that was ideating, that was bringing together internally ideas that where Gen AI can be used. And then there was a structured governance process to evaluate those ideas and pick from those that can be, one, bringing a good value from it. In fact, I wrote a small article about this on LinkedIn, and not to market myself, but if you go and you'll see one of the articles I've written recently around adapt or disappear, and how large companies can go in a structured way about their Gen AI strategy. Right? And there's a lot of what I've said there, and it was a couple of months old now, is still very true, and that's going to happen. But if you have that structured organizations that have that structured process, will probably lead the way in adoption. And so, as startup founders and marketers, you need to find out who those organizations are. If your product, leads with Gen AI.
From a startup's perspective, what's the best way to get a CIO's attention? They're obviously super busy and they're heavily being attacked by vendors in their email inbox every day.
First thing I say is don't blind email a template in LinkedIn. That's the turnoff. I mean, sometimes I get messages which addresses me as somebody else because it was cut and pasted from some, 20 different messages. Please don't do that. But let me start by saying what you can do. Get straight to your offering and the value proposition that is easy to understand. Don't put a same message to a CFO, a CIO, a head of a function. It doesn't work. Tailor your message to who the stakeholder is, what might be their role in that company, make it specific, make this value proposition stand out in two or three sentences. And that's the only way to get attention. Right? I can tell you that CIOs read their LinkedIn messages. Everybody does. They may not read it every day, but they might read once in a month. And they might decide not to even pay attention. But that's your chance to grab the eyeball, right? If you have their email ID, if you're using tools, use those. Many people use third-party tools, GTM tools, but be mindful of some practical problems. Like if you're sending an email, all likelihood is that your email might get stuck in the spam filter and might not even reach the person. So the best way, I think, is use your network. Find the influencer that you can get access to in a meaningful way, and you're sure you're going to get communicating with them, and start from there to get to even the right person. And once you get through that, right, once you get the right person, make the most of that time, right? Be very prepared for if you get a meeting or if you get a Zoom or Teams or whatever it is. Be very prepared. Don't use your standard pitches are fine, but standard pitches don't work. be very prepared for every meeting.
At which point does the CIO get involved? Like, I'm sure you don't get involved with every kinds of problem because you're running an entire org and you have a team to do a lot of different things. But like, what's the stage at which a CIO gets involved in the buying process?
I mean, size and scale of the organization obviously plays a role. But even if you're a small organization, even if you're, say $500 million small cap, or even smaller than that, CIOs always will get involved at a certain point in time. Also depends on their management style. Many CIOs will have empowered their team. Most people CIOs I know at least are highly successful people because they manage teams and they manage leaders, right? So they empower their leaders. They rely on the decision making of the leaders. There's much higher propensity of listening to startups now than 10 or 15 years ago. By that definition, CIOs are much more engaged in knowing from their direct reports or their second line reports on what's happening with which new technology, right? Who are the startups they're talking to? So that does happen, and CIOs do get engaged, and the discussions are happening in their team meetings and in their stand-ups and their town halls. Um, they may not be directly involved in talking to you until a certain point is reached. But that certain point happens when that initial value proposition has been discussed with the right people, when that message has gone to the CIO and they want to get involved before they're writing a check or before they are about to sign off on a POC that you can start the POC. At that point, you will get the audience. And again, its size and scale of the company matter. Sometimes they may not. So if you're talking to a $100 billion global organization, they may have a roster of startups that they're working with, but be mindful that they are aware of what's happening, even if you're not getting a meeting. So whoever is your decision maker, whoever you're working with, make sure that you're following the principles that we talked about. And the CIOs are very much there to know, and they are, remember CIOs and CTOs, they're tech people after all. They are going online, then looking. They're looking at, multiple tools that exist outside and in the public domain to understand what's happening in the tech world. So more often than not, and more contrary to what you might think, they may be aware of you if you are some super startup than you might imagine, right?
A lot of CIOs now are getting involved with startups in different capacities. How does one get a CIO excited about becoming potentially an advisor, and what's the right way to do that?
I think the best way to do that is first of all the fit, right? You're obviously identifying based on what industry they are from, what their experience is, what their career summary profile is. Is that relevant to what you're doing? Once that is there, approaching directly makes sense to me, please. And I would definitely give a listen to somebody who reaches out saying, look, we're looking for an advisor or an advisory board member. Do you have 10 minutes, 15 minutes, half an hour to discuss that with us? Sure. And people will listen. So again, be very clear, find the right fit. And once you find the right fit type of profile, you reach out to them and be very clear about and be again very clear why you want an advisor, what you might benefit from them, and what benefit you might provide them. It's a two-way street many times because advisors are not just looking for or CIOs are not just looking for advisory positions to because they have spare time or something like that. They might be looking to learn about new technologies. They might be looking to enhance their career to be seen as advisor to some successful startup. They might be looking for monetary gains, or they might be looking for some equity, whatever that might be. It's always good to think about these things and approach directly and speak out the mutual value proposition as what it might be for either of you. Now, sometimes some companies may not want their CIOs, and I certainly know some companies that I've been. They're very clear that they don't want their C-suite to be sitting on some boards because they want them fully focused on their jobs. So that might be a non-starter, even if the CIO wants to be an advisor, right? But you wouldn't know that. But you might do some research on that. Look for individuals that you're targeting. Look for their peers if they're sitting on any boards or them themselves who are sitting on any boards or any advisory positions, because you'll find something on the public domain that they are advisors and so on and so forth. And sometimes if you don't see the entire C-suite on any other advisor board, that's a good indication that the organization doesn't allow their C-suite to go and sit on some other advisory positions or boards. So I think these are a few pointers that I would use, but that's a great question. I've been approached multiple times. I do sit on advisory board of a couple of companies. Sometimes, I don't talk about it or it's not on my LinkedIn. And that can happen as well.
And so now, there's obviously been a big change in your life as well.
Yeah.
After many years of working in some very prestigious organizations at the highest levels, you've now donned the entrepreneur hat. Anything you'd like to share about what?
Yeah. And it's a bit premature, so I'll be measured in my response. And you, as a friend, you know that I'm working on something that will be in stealth mode for a few more months, right? So I think the genesis for this is, I've always been entrepreneur at heart. In the jobs that I've done over the last 10, 15, 20 years in corporates, I have kind of adopted that as my personal DNA of, going into big corporations and looking at the processes, see what modernizing modern technologies, new capabilities can bring in further the business. That's been my sort of mindset. And I reached a point in my career where I said, look, I've done all this fantastic work. I've a very rewarding career. Each one of my employers has given me a lot in my career. I've worked with some amazing, amazing people, managers, colleagues, subordinates, all kinds of people. As I was getting further in GXO, where I was last, and having delivered on some of the remits that I'd signed up for, there was an opportunity that came up, and I'd been thinking of this idea for about a year in, a problem statement that I've personally seen on the other side of the desk, and I've lived through the pain of that. So I'm learning on the other side of the desk. As much as I've talked about what a CIO thinks about startups, for me, this is new learning. So yes, we are working on building a B2B SaaS platform and services aligned with that in the field of data, AI processes. There's some genuine problems and there's some amazing opportunities that are coming up as a result of what's happening in the industry and these new technologies are bringing. And I do think we have a good value proposition with this seed and this thought that we are working on. So this thing is going to be, as you can see, the name of the company is Data Noetic. It's not public yet. We won't have any website for some time, but it will be sometime in the next year, early next year, in the first half of the next year. And, I'm so excited about this. Data Noetic is going to be a great story. I'm super confident of that. We are trying to solve problems that genuinely exist in mid to large size enterprises. So there's a bit of a clue there. Also, companies struggle with managing their data, expanse of their data. They spend millions of dollars on data consolidation, unification, value come from the data very clearly. But sometimes these opportunities and these projects, they don't become as successful or the value diminishes over time because the business is never static. Business keeps changing, more so now. So I think what we're building addresses that challenge, and it also looks at how we can improve processes now using Gen AI, and have some sort of a common theme across these areas that I've mentioned. So I know it's a bit ambiguous right now, but I'd say to people, hold your breath. We are coming, and we will be hopefully drawing attention and making our value evident early next year. Thank you.
Wish you all the best, Sandeep. Very excited about this journey, and I think then it'll be interesting to have you maybe a year down the line again and talk about, well, how did you go about your GTM process in this journey now that you're on the other side? I think that'll be very exciting. Thank you so much.
I got to practice what I preach, and obviously, as I say, I'm not a know-it-all. Certainly, I'm learning the ropes, but I'm certainly using the experience from the other side of the desk to perhaps address some of the things that were in my mind. So yeah, I'm very looking forward to it and see how it turns out. And thank you for your best wishes.
Thanks a lot.